Camping had always been one of my favorite ways to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant distractions of life. Out in the woods, with nothing but a tent, a fire, and the quiet sounds of nature, it was easier to breathe. My fiancé and I had been going on camping trips together for years, and over time we had built up a rhythm. Setting up camp, cooking, relaxing under the stars. We knew how to handle ourselves out there. Last summer, we planned a weekend trip to Arkansas, choosing a spot that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the main roads to feel isolated. The campground was spread out, with plenty of space between sites and thick woods separating them. It was the kind of place where you might hear someone in the distance but never see them, where the sounds of crackling fires and faint laughter disappeared into the trees before they ever reached your tent. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp at a site near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of shade, and a good spot for our tent not too far from the fire pit. The air was warm but not unbearable, the humidity hanging low over the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the smoke from other campsites, drifting through the air in lazy tendrils. By early evening, we had settled in. The fire was going, the grill was heating up, and we were starting to cook. I was flipping burgers while my fiancé poked at the fire, occasionally tossing in small sticks to keep the flame steady. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of cicadas had started to rise, their constant drone filling the air. Then we heard it, a voice, distant but loud, cut through the background noise, sharp, urgent. A man's voice yelling. At first, I thought it was just someone goofing around. Maybe a group of campers getting a little too rowdy after a few beers. But then I caught the words. Help! I froze, burger still in hand. My fiancé's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in the direction of the voice. Came again, closer this time. Without thinking, I dropped what I was doing and ran. The sound had come from a few campsites over, just beyond the trees. My feet pounded against the dirt as I weaved through the brush, the undergrowth scraping against my legs. The smell of smoke and charred food faded, replaced by something sharper, metallic. Then I saw him, a man, standing near a picnic table, swaying slightly. His clothes were soaked in something dark, pooling at his feet in the dirt. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Then I saw his leg. Blood poured from his ankle in thick, pulsing waves, pooling around his foot and seeping into his sock. It wasn't just a cut. It was gushing, spraying onto the ground in bright red streaks. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. My fiancé was right behind me, skidding to a stop as we took in the scene. I forced myself to move. Training from a first aid course years ago kicked in, apply pressure, elevate, stop the bleeding. My fiancé grabbed a towel from the man's table, pressing it hard against the wound, wrapping it as tightly as possible. Blood soaked through immediately. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite, nearly tripping over tree roots, my lungs burning. I grabbed my phone from the table, swiping at the screen with shaking hands. No service. I cursed, spinning in place. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no way to even call for one. I ran back to the man, who was now sitting on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My fiancé had managed to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. His foot twitched slightly, barely responding. I knew there was a hospital about 20 miles away, down winding back roads. A long drive in normal circumstances. Too long now. I made the decision before I could think too hard about it. I grabbed his truck keys from the picnic table, helped him to his feet as best as I could. He was heavy, leaning against me, his weight almost too much. We half-carried him to his truck, throwing open the passenger door. My fiancé climbed into the back seat, still holding pressure on his leg. I jumped behind the wheel, turned the key, and peeled out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind us. The road was dark, winding, Nothing but my high beams cutting through the night. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't let myself think too hard about what was happening. The man groaned, his head tilting toward the window. His words were slurred, mumbled. Couldn't make them out. I pushed the truck faster. I wasn't good with blood. Never had been. Even small cuts made my stomach twist. But now there was no room for that. No time to think about the warmth soaking into the seat, the way it dripped onto the floor mats. My fiancé kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, though I barely registered the words. The road stretched on forever. The dashboard clock barely moved, each second stretching into an eternity. Then finally, lights. A dull glow in the distance. The hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, barely braking before throwing the truck into park. The moment the doors opened, the man slumped, his weight shifting. The floor mat beneath him was soaked, dark and sticky. The emergency room doors burst open as staff ran toward us. Hands pulled him from the truck, voices shouting orders, the world tilting sideways. I just stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my hands slick on the steering wheel. Then, as the last of the staff rushed inside, the doors swinging closed behind them, I realized my legs were shaking. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up. Minutes blurred together. My fiancé's hand found my back, grounding me. Eventually, we sat on the curb, waiting. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone came out, telling us he would be okay. 18 stitches. That was all it took to fix something that had almost killed him. If we hadn't been there, if we had waited for an ambulance, he would have bled out. We drove back to camp in silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across our tent. The grill was still open, the half-cooked burgers untouched. We tried to salvage the night, sitting by the embers, staring at the flames. It didn't feel the same. At 10:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on gravel made us both tense. It was him, limping but alive. He looked at us, nodded. No words were needed. We had saved his life, and neither of us would ever forget it. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: 10 days alone in the woods, completely off the grid, away from everything. No work emails, no ringing phone, no people. Just me, nature, and silence. I had done trips like this before, but never for this long and never this deep into the wilderness. The cabin I found was perfect. It was an old hunting lodge, built in the 1970s by a guy who had long since moved on. A friend of a friend knew the owner and told me I could use it as long as I respected the place. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest dirt road, tucked deep in the forests of northern Montana. No power, no running water, just a roof for walls, a wood stove, and a small well outside for drinking water. I packed carefully. Freeze-dried meals, a sleeping bag, a solar lantern, plenty of firewood, a rifle, a small axe, and enough supplies to last me. I wasn't planning to hunt, but the rifle was for safety. Out here, bears were a real concern, and I wasn't about to take chances. The hike in took most of a day. The trail was barely a trail at all, just an old path used by hunters years ago. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were sore, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The place was just as I expected. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, a heavy wooden door with a rusty padlock. I had the key, and when I stepped inside, the smell of dust, old wood, and damp filled my nose. There was a single cot against one wall, a small wooden table, and shelves with a few rusted cans of food that I wouldn't be touching. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, its black iron surface slick with years of grime. A small window looked out into the trees, but it was so dirty it barely let in any light. I spent the first night settling in, stacking firewood, boiling water from the well, and making a small meal. I sat outside for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The deep woods have a different kind of silence. It's not quiet. It's full of tiny sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite place. A feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shook it off. First night jitters, nothing more. The first few days passed without much trouble. I spent my time hiking, gathering firewood, filtering water, and just enjoying the solitude. At night, I locked the door, made sure my rifle was close, and let the fire die down before sleeping. Then small things started to happen. The first was the footprints. On the fourth morning, I stepped outside and saw them. Fresh tracks in the dirt, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but as I looked closer, my stomach tightened. Barefoot, human, they weren't mine. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. They were small, maybe from a child or a small adult, and they had come right up to the cabin door. I tried to stay logical. Maybe a lost hiker? Maybe someone passing through? But 20 miles into the wilderness? Barefoot? That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle next to my sleeping bag. I barely slept, listening to every sound outside. The next day, I made a perimeter check. I found nothing at first, but then, near the well, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pile of animal bones. Small ones, rabbits, birds, picked clean and stacked neatly in a little tower. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been anything. Fox, a bobcat. Some animals hoard bones, right? But deep down, I knew better. That night, I sat in the dark, rifle in hand, waiting. The fire was low, just embers in the stove, and the cabin was silent except for my own breathing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of wood outside. The porch. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands ached. I waited, barely breathing. Another creak, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn crept through the filthy window. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, the footprints were back. More of them, circling the cabin. I needed to leave. I packed my things fast, shoving everything into my backpack. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder as I stepped outside. The forest was still, the air heavy. I started down the trail, moving fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it about 5 miles before I saw it. A deer carcass hanging from a tree. It was fresh. Blood still dripped from its torn throat, pooling on the ground. It wasn't the kill that scared me. It was the way it had been strung up, its legs tied with vines, its ribs exposed like something had been picking at it. I kept moving, pushing myself harder, sweat pouring down my back despite the cold. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was following me, watching me. I walked until my legs burned, until I couldn't go any farther. The sun was getting low, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to my truck before dark. I needed to find shelter. That's when I saw the other cabin. I hadn't seen it on any map, and it looked even older than the one I had just left. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in moss, and the door was missing. But it was shelter. I stepped inside, rifle ready. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rotting wood. There was an old table, broken chairs, and a fireplace filled with ash. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were words. "Don't sleep." My hands went cold. I backed away, heart pounding. That's when I noticed the footprints. All around me in the dust on the floor. Barefoot. Dozens of them. I didn't stay. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. The whole way, I felt it, that awful crawling feeling of being watched. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just moved, fast and desperate. When I finally reached my truck, the sun was nearly gone. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. And then, just before I turned the key, I saw it, in the rearview mirror, a figure standing at the tree line, small, hunched, motionless, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore down the road, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I say? I just know I'll never go back. And sometimes, late at night, I still dream of footprints in the dirt. The drive to the cabin took nearly 6 hours. I had left the city early, hoping to reach the place by late afternoon, but the last stretch of road was nothing but gravel and potholes. It slowed me down more than I expected. My truck bounced and groaned over the uneven path, tires spitting dust and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no other vehicles, not even an old hunting shack. Just miles of thick forest closing in from both sides, the trees growing taller and denser as I climbed higher into the hills. I had rented this cabin for a full week. I needed the break. Work had been draining me dry, and I couldn't stand the noise of the city anymore. I didn't want to hear cars honking or people yelling or the endless ringing of my phone. I wanted silence. I got what I asked for. The cabin was exactly as the listing described. Small, isolated, and simple. Just one room with a wood stove, a cot, and a table with 2 chairs. No electricity, no running water, just an old rain barrel outside that was half full from the last storm. A shed stood a few yards away, filled with firewood and rusted tools. The trees pressed in from all sides, thick and dark. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, damp with the scent of pine and earth. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just whined through the branches. Perfect. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The air was stale, like no one had been here in months. Dust floated in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the small, grimy window. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots as I set my gear down and took a look around. The cot was covered in an old wool blanket. A few dead leaves curled in the corners. The wood stove was cold, a few charred logs sitting untouched inside. A stack of old newspapers sat on the table, yellowed and brittle. I dropped my bag beside the cot and got to work setting up. I stacked firewood by the stove, filled the lantern with oil, and checked my food supply. I had packed everything I needed: canned beans, jerky, rice, a couple of protein bars. Enough to last the week. The first night, I kept things simple, heating up a can of chili on the stove and eating in silence. By the time the sun set, the forest outside had become a black wall. I hadn't realized how dark it would get without city lights. The cabin had only the lantern and the soft glow of the stove. Everything else beyond the window was pitch black. I stared out for a while, listening. Nothing, not even crickets. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went to bed early, listening to the crackling fire as I drifted off. I woke up to a sound. Something was moving outside. I stayed still, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. I listened, straining my ears. Soft footsteps, slow, careful, circling the cabin. I sat up, heart hammering. Could have been an animal, but something about the way it moved made me uneasy. It wasn't darting around like a raccoon or sniffing like a deer. It was deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the wooden walls. I stood up slowly and stepped toward the window, peering out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I waited. The footsteps had stopped. I turned off the flashlight, climbed back into bed, and lay awake for hours listening. Morning came slow. The fire had died completely, and the air was cold. I sat up, stretched, and rubbed my eyes. My mind was still foggy from the restless night. Then I saw the footprints, right outside the cabin. They weren't mine. The dirt around the porch was soft from the recent rain, and the tracks were clear. They circled the entire cabin, stopping by the window before trailing off into the trees. My stomach twisted. It wasn't an animal. The prints were human, barefoot. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe some drifter had been passing through. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost. But why would someone be wandering barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I stepped onto the porch and looked around. The forest was still, the air heavy and damp. The tracks led toward the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had driven 6 hours to get here. I had planned this trip for months. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had been half dreaming the footsteps in the night. I decided to stay. I spent the day keeping myself busy, chopped wood, cleaned up the cabin, took a short hike, making sure not to wander too far. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I made sure to lock the door. I woke up to the creaking of the porch. Someone was standing outside. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The floorboards groaned under slow, careful steps. Then silence. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, clicked it on. The light reflected off the window, blinding me for a moment. I squinted, heart pounding. Then I saw it. A face, pressed against the glass. Filthy. Smiling. I recoiled, my pulse slamming in my ears. By the time I grabbed the hatchet from beside my bed and turned back, the face was gone. I rushed to the window, shining my flashlight out. Nothing but empty woods. The trees swayed in the wind, branches creaking. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the hatchet, staring into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the rest of my trip. I didn't care about leaving food behind. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees. Then I saw them. More footprints. Not just one set. Dozens. They surrounded the cabin. Some led to the window. Others stopped at the door. My stomach turned. I had been surrounded all night. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to my truck, shoving my gear inside. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, hands shaking. The wires had been cut. My chest tightened. My head felt light. I turned, scanning the trees. I saw nothing, but I felt them watching. I grabbed my bag, my hatchet, and started walking. The nearest road was miles away, but I didn't have a choice. I walked fast, then faster, then I ran. I didn't stop until I saw the first sign of civilization, a small gas station on the edge of town. I stumbled inside, breathless, hands shaking. The clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't explain. I didn't know how to. I hitched a ride back to the city. Never went back for my truck. Never went back for anything. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but they had been close. Too close. I don't know why I rented that cabin. I had never been much of an outdoors person. Sure, I liked hiking now and then, but I had never spent more than a night in the woods, and even that had been at a campsite with bathrooms and running water. But work had been wearing me down, and something about getting away from everything for a full week sounded perfect. I found the listing online, an old hunting cabin deep in Cutler Woods. The owner described it as private and peaceful, which at the time sounded ideal. It was cheap too, probably because it had no electricity or running water, just a wood stove and an old well out back. Still, I booked it. I packed light, just a sleeping bag, a few changes of clothes, some canned food, and a hunting knife I had never actually used. I figured I'd spend the week reading, maybe hiking around a bit, just a quiet, simple trip to clear my head. I had no idea what I was walking into. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. The first few hours were on the highway, then a winding 2-lane road, then a narrow dirt path that looked like it hadn't been driven on in months. I had to take it slow, my tires kicking up dust and loose gravel. I kept checking my GPS, but I lost service miles back, and now it was just me, following the directions I had scribbled down. I finally spotted the cabin just as the sun was starting to set. It was smaller than I expected. A single-story structure with a sagging tin roof and a porch that looked like it would collapse under too much weight. The wood was dark with age, the windows streaked with dirt. The surrounding forest was thick, the trees pressing in from all sides. No neighbors, no signs of life, just silence. I stepped out of my car, stretching my legs. The air was cool, carrying the damp smell of leaves and moss. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way up the porch steps, which creaked loudly under my boots. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under a loose plank by the door. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. It smelled old, not rotten, just stale, like it had been sitting empty for a long time. Dust floated in the air, catching the last bits of sunlight through the grimy window. The place was bare. Just a wood stove, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and a cot against the wall. A stack of firewood sat in the corner, along with an old oil lantern. I dropped my bag and looked around. The silence felt heavy. I didn't think much of it at the time. I got a fire going in the stove, heated up a can of chili, and ate in silence. The wind had picked up outside, rustling through the trees. It was dark now, pitch black beyond the small glow of the cabin's windows. I stepped onto the porch for some fresh air. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions.
No streetlights, no distant headlights.
Just trees and darkness. The only sound was the wind, moving through the branches like a whisper. Then something cracked in the woods, a branch snapping underfoot. I tensed, my eyes searching the darkness. Probably just a deer. That's what I told myself. Still, I went inside and locked the door. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot and lay there, listening. The fire crackled softly. The wind hummed against the walls. Then, just as I was drifting off creek, a soft, deliberate sound, like a footstep on the porch. I held my breath, my eyes snapping open. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was just the wood settling, that I was imagining things. But I didn't sleep much that night. The footprints the next morning, I stepped outside to get some air. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They circled the cabin, pressed deep into the damp earth. Barefoot. The prints were uneven, like whoever made them had been moving slowly. Stopping. Watching. I felt something tighten in my chest. I scanned the trees, my pulse quickening. Nothing. The forest was still empty. But someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. I crouched down, studying the tracks. They led from the woods up to the porch, then back into the trees. I thought about packing up right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe some drifter had passed through. Maybe a hunter got lost. I forced myself to shake it off, but I couldn't. I kept the fire going late. I told myself I wasn't scared, but my hands trembled when I poured water from the well. Every sound made me jump. The wind sounded different now, less like a whisper, more like breathing. I locked the door, checked it twice, then lay down, my hunting knife close by. I stayed awake for hours listening. Then creak. The porch. My blood ran cold. I gripped the knife, my heart hammering. Then another sound. The doorknob, turning, slowly. I shot up, my breath caught in my throat. The door was locked, but something was trying it, testing it. The knob rattled once more, then stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, after what felt like hours, soft footsteps. Moving away. Back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I made my decision. I was leaving. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees. The footprints were there again. More of them. Closer. Something had stood by the window, watching me. My stomach twisted. I packed my bag in minutes, grabbed my keys, and headed for the car. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. My hands were shaking now. I popped the hood. The wires had been cut. I stood there, my heart pounding, the silence pressing in around me. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran down the dirt road, lungs burning, feet slamming against the gravel. I had no phone service, no way to call for help. But I didn't care. I just ran. I don't know how long it took, but eventually, I saw it, the highway. A single car driving past. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms. The driver stopped. I never went back for my car. I never went back for anything. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods, but they had been close. Too close. I always preferred solo camping over group trips. I liked the silence, the solitude, the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. No schedules, no distractions, just me, my gear, and the woods. This trip was no different. I had planned it for months, choosing a remote spot deep in the wilderness of Washington state. It was far from any official campsites, a place I found on an old topo map. A valley nestled between steep ridges, with a river running through the middle. The nearest road was over 10 miles away, and even that was nothing more than an unmaintained Forest Service road. It was exactly the kind of place I liked. Isolated, untouched, quiet. I started the hike early in the morning. The first few miles were on a faint, overgrown trail, but eventually I had to rely on my map and compass to navigate. The forest was thick, dense with towering evergreens and tangled underbrush. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds called out from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the steady rush of water. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already dipping low. The river was just as I'd imagined it. Clear, fast-moving, lined with smooth rocks. I found a flat spot on the bank and started setting up camp. First, the tent, then the fire pit. I gathered wood, stacked it neatly, and got a small fire going as the last light faded from the sky. The heat felt good against the evening chill. I cooked a quick meal, ate while staring into the flames, and let my mind settle into the rhythm of the woods. As the fire crackled, I started to get that feeling. The one I always ignored at first. The prickling at the back of my neck. The sense of being watched. It was common when camping alone, just a natural reaction to being so exposed. My brain playing tricks on me, filling the silence with imagined threats. I brushed it off and focused on the fire. The woods around me were quiet, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Nothing unusual. But then I heard something. A soft crunch. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. A footstep. I froze, my heart hammering. I listened. Silence. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, even just a branch falling. I waited, every muscle tensed. Nothing else moved. Eventually, I let out a slow breath and stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. The beam flickered over trunks, branches, undergrowth. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed up longer than I had planned, letting the fire burn low before finally forcing myself into the tent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening. Every sound felt magnified, the river, the wind, the distant call of an owl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone out here. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, just that something was wrong. I listened. The fire was out, the night deep and black. The river was still rushing, the wind still whispering through the trees. Then I heard it, a sound close to my tent. Soft, careful, a footstep. My body went rigid. I reached for my flashlight with slow, deliberate movements. My fingers wrapped around it, my thumb pressing against the switch. I waited. Another step. Closer this time. I clicked the light on. The beam shot through the darkness, illuminating the thin fabric of my tent. Shadows shifted. Something moved just outside. I barely breathed. The shape didn't move for several seconds. Then slowly it backed away. I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps retreated into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag, shoved my gear into my pack. I wanted to be gone before whoever or whatever was out there came back. As I was taking down my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. They circled my campsite, stopped just outside my tent. I hiked out fast. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. Took me almost the entire day to reach my truck. When I finally saw it, sitting there on the empty dirt road, relief washed over me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw something in the trees. A figure, standing just at the edge of the forest, half hidden in the shadows. Watching. I didn't wait. I started the truck, tore down that road faster than I ever had in my life. I never went back to that valley. I never even told anyone about what happened. But I stopped camping alone after that. I didn't go looking for trouble. I never do. But somehow it always finds me. This time, it found me in a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, with no phone service and no one around to hear me scream. I had rented the place for a week, thinking it would be the perfect way to clear my head. Work had been crushing me, and I just needed some time away from everything. No emails, no calls, no deadlines. Just silence, fresh air, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to get through. The listing described it as an isolated retreat. That should have been my first warning. But I booked it anyway. Getting there was harder than I expected. The directions took me off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path that barely looked drivable. My car bounced over rocks and potholes, dust kicking up in thick clouds behind me. The trees on either side grew so close that their branches scraped against my windows, like fingers dragging along the glass. There was no cell service. I wasn't surprised. I had lost bars miles back. But still, the silence in my car felt heavier once I noticed it. It took nearly 40 minutes to reach the cabin. By the time I pulled up, the sun was already starting to set. The place was small, just a one-room structure with a tin roof and a wraparound porch. The wood was dark and weathered, the windows coated in a layer of dust. A single chimney jutted from the side, connected to the old wood stove inside. There was no electricity, no running water, just a well out back and an outhouse about 50 yards into the trees. The forest pressed in thick from all sides. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. Something about the place felt wrong, not in a supernatural way. I don't believe in ghosts or curses or anything like that, but the silence was off. Too deep, like the woods were holding their breath. I shook it off and got out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way to the porch. The wooden planks creaked under my boots. The key was exactly where the owner had said it would be, under the loose board by the door. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. It smelled stale, like dust and old wood, like it had been sitting empty for a long time. The furniture was basic, a small table, 2 chairs, a cot against the far wall. A pile of firewood was stacked neatly in the corner, next to an old hunting rifle mounted on the wall. I dropped my bag and let out a breath. The silence pressed in. I tried not to let it get to me. I got a fire going in the wood stove, heated up a can of soup, and ate in silence. Outside, the last bit of daylight faded, and the darkness settled in fast. I hadn't realized just how deep I was in the woods until then. There were no distant headlights, no hum of traffic, just blackness pressing against the windows. I stepped onto the porch to get some air. The trees loomed around me, stretching high into the sky. The stars were bright, but they did little to cut through the darkness below. The air was still. No wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Then a sound. Soft, far away, a branch snapping underfoot. I stiffened, my eyes searching the darkness. Nothing, just trees. Probably an animal. A deer, maybe. I went inside and locked the door. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot and lay down, staring at the ceiling. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the cabin. Then a creak. From the porch. I held my breath. Could have been the wood settling. That's what I told myself. But then I heard it again, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I sat up, my pulse hammering. Then the doorknob, turning, slowly. I grabbed my hunting knife from my bag and gripped it tight. The knob rattled once more, then stopped. Silence. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Then soft footsteps moving away, back into the woods. I didn't sleep. At sunrise, I went outside. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. Barefoot. They circled the cabin, stopping by the door. My stomach twisted. I scanned the trees, every instinct in me screaming to run. But my car was still parked where I left it, untouched. Whoever had been out here hadn't messed with it, which meant they didn't want me to leave. Not yet. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a hiker. Maybe someone got lost. But I knew that wasn't true. I spent the day keeping busy, chopping wood, fetching water from the well, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. By the time the sun started setting, I was on edge. I locked the door, checked it twice, sat by the fire with the knife in my lap, listening, waiting. It started earlier this time. The footsteps, circling the cabin, stopping just outside the window. Then a tap, soft, deliberate, tap, tap, tap. I gripped the knife so hard my hand ached. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then a sound I'll never forget. A breath, right outside the window. Slow, steady, like someone was standing there, watching me. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then soft footsteps retreating into the woods. I sat there until the fire died. I didn't sleep. I made my decision the second the sun came up. I was leaving. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything inside, and stepped onto the porch. The woods felt different, like they were waiting. I ran to my car, heart pounding. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, my hands shaking. The wires had been cut. I turned, scanning the trees. The silence pressed in. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my bag and ran. I don't know how long I ran. My legs burned. My lungs screamed. But I didn't stop. Then, finally, the road. A single car coming around the bend. I stumbled into the street, waving my arms. The driver slammed on the brakes. I never went back. I don't know who or what was in those woods, but I know this: they let me go because they wanted me to remember. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being out there, deep in the woods with no one around, that made me feel like I had stepped outside of the world for a while. I liked the silence, the feeling of being totally untethered from the rest of my life.
No sedulis, no conversations, no expectations.
Just me, the trail, and the sound of my own footsteps. That's how I ended up hiking a remote trail in Montana late one afternoon, pushing further into the wilderness than I probably should have. I had been on a road trip for a few weeks, moving through the northern states, camping out when I could, staying in cheap motels when I couldn't. I had spent most of my time on well-traveled trails, places where I could pass other hikers every so often and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But that morning, I had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town I barely remember the name of, and the guy behind the counter told me about a trail a few miles out. "No one really goes up that way," he had said. "Not because it's dangerous, just kind of out of the way." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I drove out there, found the unmarked dirt lot he had mentioned, and set off into the woods with my pack strapped tight to my shoulders. It was perfect at first. The trail was well maintained but clearly not heavily used. The trees were thick, towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a stream somewhere off to the right. Felt like I had stepped into another world. I should have turned back before it got dark. I had planned to hike out about 4 miles, then loop back before the sun set. But the trail was beautiful, and I kept pushing forward, telling myself I would turn around just after the next bend, then just after the next clearing. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I was farther from my car than I had meant to be. I wasn't worried yet. I had my flashlight, extra water, and a small knife clipped to my belt. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, even in low light. I knew what I was doing. At least I thought I did. I was about 2 miles from my car when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, the total suffocating absence of sound. The birds had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant rush of the stream was gone. I stopped walking. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in around me. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pick up anything. An insect buzzing, a branch creaking, my own heartbeat. Nothing. That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Everything looked the same as it had before. Just woods, just the trail, just me. But the silence lingered. I started walking again, a little faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. It was the only sound in the world. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came back to life. A bird chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. The distant stream was there again, whispering through the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But I picked up my pace anyway. About a mile from my car, I saw the first footprint. It was right there in the dirt, just off the side of the trail. Deep, clear, recent. It wasn't mine. I stopped, shining my flashlight over it, my stomach twisting. It was a boot print, same as mine, but bigger, wider, and it was pointing perpendicular to the trail, as if someone had stepped out of the woods, paused, then stepped back in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The second footprint was even fresher. This one was right in the middle of the trail. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No one had passed me. No one should have been this deep in the woods at this hour. I swept my flashlight along the ground, looking for more prints. There were none, just that single boot print pressed firm into the dirt. I took a step back, my body tense. My heart was beating too fast now. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, my pulse hammering. The trees stood still, thick and unmoving. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff, my breath tight in my chest. I was almost to the car. I just needed to get there. The last stretch of trail felt endless. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping the beam along the ground, watching for more footprints, for movement, for anything. The silence had returned, thick and absolute. Then, finally, I saw it, the dark shape of my car sitting in the dirt lot up ahead. Relief flooded me. I was almost there. And then, just as I stepped off the trail, I caught one last thing in the flashlight beam. Another boot print. This one was different. It was facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I walked straight to my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking the doors the second I was in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my headlights flooding the empty lot. Empty, but I didn't wait. I pulled out fast, my tires kicking up dust, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who made those footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker, though that seems unlikely. No one parks at that trailhead. No one hikes out there. It's too isolated, too empty. I keep thinking about that last footprint, the one facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, and I wonder how long had they been out there, and how close had they gotten without me knowing.